My uncle had a seat on the board of Apple Inc. He was the most successful man I know. Today, I found his suicide note, and it reads like this. I am Mr. Alan Everton, BSc MBA. I do not ask for your pity nor your forgiveness. I only ask that you understand. On June 29, 2007, we released the first Apple iPhone. It was, as you all know, an overnight sensation that revolutionized the cell phone market forever. It changed the way humans communicate. What we created was nothing less than modern marvel. As the lead product designer of the original iPhone, I was happy to take part in the triumph of innovation that we had given the world. The launch party was probably the best moment of my professional career. Apart from the birth of my daughter, it was undeniably the best day of my life. I reveled in the adoration of my peers. They toasted me and sang my praises. We drank champagne from the bottle and danced into the night. A very drunk Steve Jobs called me the smartest motherfucker in the whole fucking city. No one believes me when I tell him that, but it's 100% true. My work on the original iPhone got me a seat on the board of Apple Inc. There, Steve put me in charge of overseeing the development of iPhone 3G. If the original iPhone was my magnum opus, the iPhone 3G would be the exact opposite, except that would be understating it. The iPhone 3G was not only the worst thing I ever did, it is the worst thing anyone ever created in the entire history of humanity. It is my great shame that I never told you this, but here's my story. For 6 months, I dedicated my life to working out what was happening. It was infuriating to not know where we went wrong. After months of work with no breakthrough, we began to fear we would never know what went wrong. But then something happened which changed everything. With the incredible success of the original model, there was an immense public demand for a newer and better model. Of course there was. There always is. And the board wanted nothing more than to fulfill that demand. There was a huge amount of pressure on us to release something with serious product feature upgrade in a very short amount of time. It wasn't easy. We had to put in some massive nights working on it, developing, tweaking, and eking out as much performance from the device as possible. The team around me was fantastic. Full credit to them for the amazing work they did. We released it on July 11, 2008, and once again it was a huge commercial success, selling millions worldwide in just the first week. By all practical measure, the iPhone 3G was a resounding success. But there was something bugging me. Some of the data transfer just wasn't as fast as it was meant to be. After a couple of weeks of it being on the market, this became abundantly clear. Specifically, photo files sent via mobile internet to other iPhone devices were transferring about 8% slower than they should be. All our research, all the math said that it should be faster. We tried looking at our compression system, at our upload speeds. Perhaps the battery was less powerful than we previously thought. Nothing could explain it. I went to Steve with my dilemma. I wasn't sure if it would give a shit because the issue was not affecting the sales of the devices. And even the harshest critics couldn't tell the difference between the actual speed and what it was meant to be. But I underestimated him. Like anyone that has been as successful as him, Steve Jobs had an all-encompassing hatred for failure. The fact that we were underperforming, even by the smallest margin, drove him crazy. Together, we looked at all the possible scenarios, anything that could have anything to do with that missing 8% data transfer speed. It put his best man on it, dedicating an entire department of 50 engineers for the sole purpose to work out the cause of the loss. He commissioned university professors to run studies on the capabilities of 3G networks. He ran investigations into whether anything could possibly be choking the airwaves, something we hadn't anticipated that could already be on the networks. I was contacted by a postgraduate electrical engineering student at the University of Delaware by the name of Devin Chua, who had stumbled onto something. He ran a macro analysis of the data transfer from thousands of different locations, trying to work out if the speed varied depending on what cell tower it bounced off. Everywhere the test was run returned the exact same result. It was always 8% slower than our math had told us it should be. But there were certain areas where, by just a fraction of a percentage point, the transfer was even slower, no matter what was sent or whom it was sent to. This was the first breakthrough we had in months, so naturally we threw money at him. We had him hire an entire team and run the test from millions of different locations throughout the continental United States. The results that came back were astonishing. The data transfer was consistently, across the board, a fraction of a point slower when both the phones and the cell towers were within a short distance of hospitals, morgues, and cemeteries. This made no sense to me at all, so I asked him, what would possibly explain this phenomenon? When he told me his findings, it was like the ground had been pulled from under me. Sir, I believe we have discovered what was slowing down your data. There was already something on the network, and I think it could be souls. Of course, I couldn't just accept this on its face value. So I had Devin partnered with a noetic scientist at MIT by the name of Professor David Gordon to study how it was possible for there to be something else on our network at the same frequency slowing us down. Part of the study involved them going to the Central African Republic and building the first 3G network there so as to compare the effects of the phenomenon in a country where 3G was not currently popularized. They came back with incredible results. They had discovered something. It wasn't a particle and it wasn't a radio signal. So they couldn't really put into words what it was. So they just called it something. Whatever this something was, it apparently moved or operated on a coincidentally similar form of communication to the iPhone 3G and most other modern smartphones. Because it was on our frequency, it was slowing down our data transfer. But the most haunting discovery was the effect our phones were having on the something. When they had set up their system in Africa, the speed of the data transfer varied, whereas in America, it was always consistently 8% slower. There was a lot more evidence which built up the case, but that was the smoking gun. I couldn't deny it anymore. I was terrified to tell Steve the answer for fear that he would accuse me of making a mockery of his company, but I knew I had to say something. I presented to Steve Jobs in his office, one-on-one. I prefaced it by telling him that, as absurd as it sounded, I promised I was telling the truth. Then it all spilled out of me. We had discovered empirical evidence of the human soul. Souls had an intricate system of transferring out of dying bodies. They leave the body and connect to a network which by pure coincidence was formatted extremely similar to the one that we use to transfer files between iPhones. The soul then appears to make a number of rapid and erratic movements around the earth. We suspect that it may be making contact with family members. Then after it has completed its course, the soul disappears, presumably to the afterlife. Possibly it finds a new host. This theory held up in Africa, but in America we were increasingly seeing this system being circumvented. Souls were being trapped in a meaningless loop, thrown off their task by random transfer of cell phone data, causing them to become lost and to abandon their task. Millions of souls were now stuck in our system, and not disappearing the way they were meant to. We had created a modern-day purgatory where no souls could ever leave Earth, forever being bounced around by random dick pics and Instagram lunches. Steve looked at me. When I say looked, I mean stared. Deeply, menacingly, silently. I saw him mulling over what I had just said. At first, I was afraid that he would throw me out of his office and his company. Then I began to realize that the expression on his face was much more sinister and much more terrified than I had previously thought. This was not a matter of being fired. This was much, much worse. He must have stayed there silently still for a good 10 minutes before he spoke. How many people know about this? Just myself, Devin, Professor Gordon, and you, sir. Good. Let's have it stay that way. Do not repeat this to anyone. You may go. And that was it. I left his office and went home. I had told Steve that was my job. The whole thing was now out of my hands. It was his responsibility now. I might just retire and take a nice long holiday with the wife to the Greek islands. The next day, there was $6 billion in my bank account, and both Devin and Professor Gordon were dead. I understood the message. I was to say nothing. This was hush money, but it was also a threat and a show of power. If I said a word of this to anyone, Steve Jobs would never be able to sell another phone. I don't care how principled you are. When a man like Steve Jobs wants something and is willing to do whatever it takes to make it happen, you don't stand up against him. This has been my great shame for the past 10 years. I stayed silent. I allowed the iPhones to keep operating. Millions and millions of souls now have been forever separated from their God. They will never reach heaven. My priest, when I was a child, once told me that hell is by definition a permanent separation from God's love. By that interpretation, I am the devil. Please forget me. I am not one who deserves to be remembered. Do not hold a funeral. Leave me in an unmarked grave and move on. Alright guys, I hope you guys have enjoyed this story, and if you have, now go burn your iPhones or throw it off the cliff. But all kidding aside, this story reminded me of Duncan McDougall's 21-gram theory, a theory in which he claimed a person's soul weighs 21 grams, according to his research. He basically put dying people on a giant scale and he measured their weights pre and post-mortem. I should, however, mention that this theory has been debunked several times by several different researchers and is considered pseudoscience more than anything. With that said, I believe it was still the first scientific, well, at least in spirit, no pun intended, attempt to explain the human soul in a more quantifiable manner. McDougall's research, of course, didn't add anything to the science of the human soul, but nevertheless, it brought attention to a subject that was rarely discussed in scientific terms. In today's world, thanks to the research in quantum mechanics, scientists are a step closer to explaining what a soul is, at least in theory. It's also interesting to note that some of the research in relation to the human soul and quantum entanglement can be directly and/or indirectly correlated to the ancient Buddhist texts, the yogic complete state of immersion, and the notion that wisdom, truth, and consciousness are embedded in the universe, which were widely preached in both the East and the West. Regardless of whether this story is true or not, it does make me think about the consequences of modern-day technology, because over the past 100 years, we have advanced our knowledge at a blistering speed, and thanks to that, we've become very adept at implementing new technologies into our everyday lives, but the consequences of their usage is still very unclear to us in many respects. So even if this story isn't true, who's to say that something of its nature is impossible? If modern science has taught us anything, is that we know very little of the world we inhabit, both physically and spiritually. This is some exciting and scary times that we're living in, but hopefully the future holds more of the former and less of the latter. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.